Okay, here we go for part 3. So we've just been through Sharif's boys camp studies. And one of the things that you can do for the question and answer session, the live discussion that we'll have on the 26th of April, is to provide a written answer to this question. Describe Sharif's boys camp studies and why they were so important. So if you can describe those studies in your own words, and we're now going to spend a little bit of time thinking about their importance. So from these boys' camp studies, and there was more than one, and the results have been replicated amongst other groups as well, Sharif developed realistic group conflict theory. And what was important about this theory is that really for it was a beginning point where stereotyping and prejudice were seen to be the outcomes of group life, the outcomes of the way in which groups related to each other, and whether there was realistic conflict between them, where both groups wanted to achieve the same outcome, so they were in conflict in terms of their goals. And if there is conflict between the groups, then we can see evidence of stereotyping and prejudice. So for the first time, it's very clearly demonstrated that negative stereotypes and prejudice reflect the pattern of shared and competing goals. That when groups have these conflicting goals, it fosters ethnocentrism, where they think that their own group is superior and better, and that other groups, the sort of competing groups, are in fact inferior and are perceived negatively. We also see from realistic group conflict theory insights into how to reduce and overcome prejudice and conflict through the creation of higher order shared goals. So when there were things that both groups were motivated to try and achieve, they worked together and cooperation emerged as a result. So we can see these are the key elements of realistic group conflict theory. And what we see with this approach is that it does represent a major advance because it tells us that if features of the social world change, the way in which groups relate to one another change, so too will stereotyping and prejudice. One of the issues and one of the reasons why this trajectory of work it declines a bit is because it's seen to be very descriptive. Sharif can't really shed light into what's going on psychologically, what's going on in people's heads to help us explain what he's observing in this very naturalistic experiment. And so we don't get much of the insight into psychology. We said that one of the things we were going to try and do was sort of judge these theories, I guess, in terms of how well they might help us account for the increase in prejudice that we're hearing about in relation to COVID-19. And I guess you could say that this theory does fit with those examples that, for example, prejudice towards foreigners is on the increase. Because here we have something has changed in the world. We have a situation where there's increased fear and threat. And given what's changed in the world, the nature of the relationships between the groups has changed. And therefore, as those relations have got more threatening and people have become more interested in who has the virus, who might sort of pass the virus on, who's at risk of giving you the virus. We see this distinction of foreigner versus non-foreigner emerging. So using this as a bit of an example, we can see that the sociocultural theory can help us explain instances where you might see sudden increases in prejudice towards foreigners in particular countries. If we just think about the contribution of this perspective a little bit more, it is an intergroup perspective because we're clearly explaining prejudice and stereotyping through looking through the lens of the force of the group and not to do with individual explanations for these attitudes. So prejudice is very much seen to be an intergroup attitude. It's seen to be meaningful and functional. It's helping people understand how their own group relates to other groups and whether that relationship is cooperative or conflictual. There's some interesting ideas here that we might debate whether people's views are right or wrong. That can be part of social debate. But when it comes to the psychological process that leads to prejudice, it's showing us that people view the world from the position of their own in-group. So although we can say that someone's views are right or wrong, we can also see the psychology is that people are actually seeing the world from the perspective of their own in-group. And so in a way, that perspective is meaningful in helping people understand events in the world around them. And we also, again, speaking a little bit to this idea of prejudice reduction or how we might address prejudice, we can see that if it's possible to change the nature of intergroup relations, then it's possible to increase or decrease prejudice. So we, through this socio-cultural perspective, also see a way to address prejudice itself, and we're going to come back to that. So let's go on to the sort of second theoretical perspective to help us understand why people might be prejudiced. So this is the psychodynamic approach, and it has some overlap with the personality approach. So these are really individual explanations for stereotyping and prejudice, as opposed to it being a group-based explanation. So here with the psychodynamic approach, we have it well integrated as a psychological analysis. So we do get insight here into the psychological processes. The psychodynamic approach sees prejudice as being related to frustration and to a distinct personality syndrome, which they called authoritarianism. And that's where we feed into more of the personality type account. So this model has its origins in the work of Freud, and the argument is that people experience frustration for all kinds of reasons when they can't achieve their goals. So that frustration can build up, and often the people who are causing the frustration may actually be others who are more powerful. So you can imagine if you're a child in a home, you could become very frustrated with your treatment by your parents, but there's very little you can do with that frustration because your parents are in a more powerful position than you are. So what happens is that people will displace that frustration as aggression onto less powerful targets, also referred as scapegoating. So frustration builds up because we can't achieve our goal, and then that is displaced through aggression onto less powerful targets because the source of the frustration is beyond an individual's reach. And so we tend to aggress targets that are less powerful, and we tend to blame them for, in fact, the sources of our frustration, the goals that we can't achieve. And some of the supporting evidence for this comes from studies of lynchings, the hanging of African Americans in the American South during the late 19th and early 20th century. And what these researchers, Hovland and Sears, found was that the number of lynchings actually increased when the economic conditions worsened. So the idea here is that people aren't getting the price they want for their product, for their cotton. They're becoming very frustrated about their economic conditions. It's very difficult for them to address the source of that problem. And so that frustration is displaced as aggression towards a less powerful target, African Americans, during this time. So this is, the kind of model that governs this psychodynamic perspective. And some of the critique of the model is that it does remain very unclear why some minorities are the target of aggression and not others. So it's not clear why African Americans, why not a different group at that time. What does the theory have to say about which minorities will be the target of this aggression? And part of the critique is that to understand which of the targets will be aggressed, it's necessarily to better understand the majority group itself. So what is the relationship between the majority group and the minority group? And how does the majority group make sense of themselves? What's the stereotype of their group, in order to try and understand which targets aggression will be expressed towards, where that frustration will be targeted. And, one of the examples, again, comes out of World War II, where as part of the underlying reasons why the Jewish people were treated in such a cruel way during World War II, is that part of it was connected to the definitions of what it meant to be German. So the identity of being German was seen to be not aligned at all with the identity of being Jewish. And you can see here in this quote, the Jewish spirit undermines the healthy powers of German people. So at the same time that a target is being scapegoated and aggression and violence is being directed to that group, there's also a sense in which it's tied to what it means to be German in the context of that intergroup conflict. So in some ways, the frustration aggression model has some limitations in explaining who will be the target of aggression, and perhaps there needs to be more engagement, a bit in light of the direction that Sharif leads us, to understand the nature of the intergroup relationship and what is the meaning of the aggressor group and the victim group in trying to understand the frustration-aggression relationship. When we move from frustration-aggression to the personality model, we still have a focus on the individual in trying to explain prejudice. But in this model, prejudice is related to personality factors. And there's certain personalities that are more likely to express prejudice than others. And one of the reasons why this personality explanation emerged is because there was evidence that if people were prejudiced towards one group, then they were also likely to be prejudiced towards a range of other groups. So given that, that's why there was a view that perhaps it was part of a personality syndrome or problem, as reflected here. One of the facts of which we are most certain is that people who reject one outgroup will tend to reject other outgroups. If a person is anti-Jewish, he is also likely to be anti-Catholic, anti-Negro, or anti any other group. So we're going to go on to talk about what these personalities are by talking about authoritarianism, but we might just leave this part here, and we'll be back shortly.